She had 60 days to save 14 children, and the man who could help her had nothing left to lose but everything he'd already decided to give away. If this story moves you, stay until the very end, and drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to hurt before it gets better. The last 60 days. The stove had been dying for 3 days before Evelyn Harper finally admitted it to herself. She'd been feeding it scraps of broken crate wood since Tuesday, stretching the last of the coal across 4 nights by letting the fire burn low after the children went to bed and piling on every blanket she could find before she herself lay down on the narrow cot in the room off the kitchen. The temperature outside had dropped to something that made the windows creak in their frames. November in Harlan's Crossing didn't apologize to anybody. She stood in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, wrapped in a wool shawl that had seen better years, and watched the coals pulse orange and slow. The pot of oatmeal on the grate was barely simmering. She stirred it anyway, just to have something to do with her hands. 14 children asleep in the rooms above her. The oldest was 16, a boy named Thomas who had started shaving and pretending he didn't care about anything. The youngest was 4, a girl named Clara, who still slept with a folded piece of burlap she called her rabbit, because someone had told her once that it looked like one, and she'd believed it so completely that she couldn't sleep without it. 14 children, 60 days. She had counted the days twice when Nathaniel Ames handed her the letter, as if the second count might come up different. It hadn't. 60 days from the 1st of November to the 1st of January, when the building would pass from the estate of Edmund Ames, who had died quietly in his sleep in September, to a developer out of the East named Victor Porter, who had plans for a hotel that would have crystal chandeliers and a dining room that served food with French names. Nathaniel Ames had delivered the news the way a doctor delivers a difficult diagnosis, without cruelty, without warmth, and with the general air of a man who had somewhere better to be. He'd stood in the front room of the orphanage, with his hat in his hands and his coat freshly pressed, and explained that his father's estate had debts, that the building was the primary asset, and that the sale to Porter had already been arranged before Edmund had passed. He was sorry. He truly was. But there was nothing to be done. He'd left before the children came down to breakfast, which Evelyn suspected was not an accident. That had been the 1st of November. It was now the 12th. She heard the creak of the stairs, the 3rd step from the bottom, the one that sang like a sick cat no matter how carefully you came down. And then Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, dragging the burlap rabbit by one ear. "Is it morning?" Clara asked. "Getting there," Evelyn said. "Go back up. It's too cold down here yet." "I can hear the wind." "I know." "Is the roof going to blow off?" "No." Clara considered this. She was 4 years old and had a serious face that she wore like it was a job. "How do you know?" "Because I'd have to fix it if it did, and I don't have time for that." Clara thought about that too, apparently decided it was reasonable, and disappeared back up the stairs. The 3rd step creaked. Evelyn turned back to the oatmeal. She had $43 in the household account. She had a stove that was dying. She had a building she didn't own and never had owned, which was something she had understood since the beginning, but had never let herself think about too hard because Edmund Ames had been a decent man who had told her once, years ago, that as long as he was alive, the orphanage would stay. He'd meant it. He just hadn't figured on dying. She was thinking about whether she had enough to cover another load of coal. Probably not without cutting back on flour, when she heard wheels outside. Heavy wheels. A wagon. She went to the front window and looked out through the frost on the glass. There was a wagon in the yard, loaded high with split wood. On the seat was a man she didn't recognize, broad in the shoulder, dark-coated, with a hat pulled low against the wind. He climbed down from the seat without looking at the house and went to the back of the wagon and started unloading wood onto the ground beside the porch steps, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done a great deal of physical work and had stopped thinking about it years ago. Evelyn pulled the shawl tighter and went to the door and opened it. The cold hit her face like a wet rag. "Can I help you?" she called. The man didn't look up right away. He set down an armful of wood and straightened. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with a jaw like something carved out of a harder substance than the rest of him, and dark eyes that assessed the situation quickly and without drama. "Garrett Cole," he said. I run the Double C north of the Miller Road fork. Heard you were low on wood. Evelyn blinked. Who told you that? Old Perkins at the mill. He mentioned it. He turned back to the wagon and picked up another armful. Where do you want it stacked? She stopped. Mr. Cole, I haven't arranged to buy any wood. I don't have... Didn't ask you to buy it. He set the wood down at the base of the porch steps and looked at her directly for the first time. Where do you want it stacked? She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't seem annoyed either. He just seemed to be waiting for an answer to a practical question. Along the side of the porch, she said. Under the overhang, so it stays dry. Right. He picked up another armful. She went inside and stood in the kitchen and listened to him stacking wood for the better part of an hour. Then she heard him climb back up on the wagon. She went back to the window in time to see him turn the wagon back toward the road without knocking, without waiting for thanks, without any of the performance that charity usually came wrapped in. She watched him go. She found out more about Garrett Cole in the next few days, partly because she asked around and partly because Harlan's Crossing was the kind of town where information moved faster than weather. The Double C was a serious operation. Not the biggest ranch in the territory, but well-run and respected. Garrett Cole had built it himself, or rebuilt it, depending on who you asked. He'd inherited the land from his father, but the land had been mortgaged and half ruined, and Garrett had spent the better part of a decade turning it into something that actually worked. He ran cattle, kept a small remuda of horses, had 2 full-time ranch hands, and brought on seasonal labor for branding and drive. He was quiet, people said, but not unfriendly. He kept to himself. He had been married once, his wife had died 6 years ago, and he didn't talk about it. He didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. Evelyn told herself she hadn't been listening for wagon wheels and almost convinced herself it was true. He came back on a Thursday evening. She was in the middle of supper, a pot of bean soup and cornbread, the best she could do with what she had, when there was a knock at the door and she opened it to find Garrett Cole standing on the porch with a sack of flour over one shoulder and a look on his face that suggested he had thought about knocking and then decided he might as well get it over with. Thought you could use flour, he said. We can, she said. You want to come in? We're eating. He looked past her into the kitchen, where 10 of the 14 children were sitting at the long table, watching him with the frank assessment that children apply to strangers. I don't want to impose, he said. There's soup left, she said. Sit down. He sat down. One of the younger boys, a 7-year-old named Pete, who had opinions about everything, immediately climbed onto the bench beside him and wanted to know if he had a horse. Garrett said yes. Pete wanted to know how many. Garrett said 12. Pete's eyes went wide, which was apparently the reaction Garrett had calculated because something in his face relaxed slightly. Thomas, the 16-year-old, watched Garrett from the other end of the table with the deliberate skepticism of someone who had decided not to be impressed by anything and was working hard at it. Evelyn watched all of this while she served soup and tried to figure out what Garrett Cole was doing in her kitchen and why he had driven over from the Double C on a cold November evening with a sack of flour. After supper, while the children cleaned up with the performance of effort that meant they weren't actually doing much, Garrett stayed at the table and drank the last of the coffee. Evelyn sat across from him. I appreciate the wood, she said, and the flour. I want to be straight with you. I don't know what this is, and I'd rather ask directly than guess. He looked at her. I heard about the sale, he said, the Porter deal. Word gets around. In a town this size, everything gets around. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I thought you could probably use some help. People have been very kind, she said carefully, because that was the version she told herself. We've had a number of offers of sympathy. Garrett's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Sympathy's not worth much in a cold kitchen. No, she said, it is not. He nodded like she'd confirmed something. I'll come back Saturday, he said. There's a shutter on the east side that's coming loose. I noticed it when I pulled in. She didn't ask him why he was doing this. He didn't explain. He finished his coffee and said goodnight to the children and went home. He came back Saturday, like he said. November moved in the way November does in hard country, gray and methodical and getting colder by degrees. Garrett Cole came back every few days, and then every other day. And then one evening he just showed up at supper and nobody seemed surprised, including Evelyn, which surprised her when she thought about it later. He fixed the shutter. He replaced 2 rotting boards on the front porch. He brought a new length of stovepipe when the old one developed a crack and started backing smoke into the kitchen. He didn't make announcements about any of it. He just arrived with what was needed and did the work. The children, who were not fools, worked him out quickly. Clara started sitting next to him at supper without asking permission, which was her highest expression of trust. She showed him the burlap rabbit and explained at length about how it was a rabbit, and he listened with complete seriousness and agreed that yes, it did look like a rabbit. Clara was satisfied. Pete asked him constantly about the horses and extracted over the course of several evenings nearly everything there was to know about the Double C's Remuda, their names, their temperaments, which ones were mean and which ones were lazy, and which one was Pete's favorite based solely on its name, which was Hector. Thomas maintained his position of deliberate indifference for about 10 days, which Evelyn thought was actually a record for Thomas. Then he came down one morning, and Garrett was already there repairing a stuck window latch, and Thomas stood and watched without saying anything for a while, and finally said, "You're doing that wrong." Garrett said, "Show me." Thomas showed him. Garrett said it was a better way. Thomas went to school looking for the first time in a while, like someone who had something to think about other than what was coming. Evelyn watched all of it. She also watched herself with the same wary attention she applied to everything she couldn't control. She was 34 years old and had been running this orphanage since she was 23 and had learned a very long time ago that the things you needed most were also the things most likely to disappear. She had built herself into someone who needed very little, or had told herself that story long enough that she mostly believed it. And here was Garrett Cole, sitting at her supper table every night with sawdust on his coat, and a patience she recognized as the real kind, not the performed kind, and she did not know what to do with that. She had scars, not the kind you could see easily, but he didn't ask about them. She suspected he had his own and didn't particularly want to discuss those either. They were 2 people who had arrived at a common understanding without negotiating it, which was either efficient or alarming, and she wasn't sure which. One night, after the children were in bed, she was working through the household accounts at the kitchen table, and he was sitting across from her with a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for, and she hadn't offered. She'd just poured it. Going through a list of needed repairs in an order of priority he'd written out in a handwriting that was surprisingly careful. "You're going to run short on lamp oil before the end of the month," he said, looking at what she was working on without making a thing of it. "I know," she said. "I can bring some from the Double C." "You can't keep—" She stopped. "You're giving away a lot." He looked at her. "I have a lot," he said. It came out flat and factual, no performance of generosity in it. "And I'm using maybe a quarter of my supplies. It's just sitting in a storage building." She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the lamp on the table between them, which was burning low and making the light warm and small against the dark outside. "My wife wanted children," he said finally. "We tried for 4 years. It didn't happen." He paused. "She died. And the ranch went on being the ranch, and I went on running it. And it's a good ranch, but—" He stopped. "I don't know how to explain the rest of it." Evelyn looked back down at the accounts. "You don't have to," she said. He didn't. They sat in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which told her something she wasn't ready to think about yet. The town of Harlan's Crossing had not been unkind to Evelyn exactly. The problem with the town was more complicated than unkind. The town was sympathetic, and sympathy turned out to have a pretty rigid ceiling when it came to actual action. The council had listened to her in their October meeting. She'd gone with her documents and her figures and her very clear explanation of what 60 days meant for 14 children. And they had listened politely and expressed genuine concern and explained at considerable length why there was nothing they were in a position to do about a private property transaction that had been legally executed before Edmund Ames died. The ladies' auxiliary had brought 2 pies and a ham and left them on the porch, which was kind, and then gone home. The Reverend at the Methodist Church had mentioned the orphanage in his Sunday sermon, and a collection had produced $11.40, which paid for half a month's lamp oil. 3 families in town had told Evelyn that if it truly came down to it, they could perhaps take 1 child, just 1, and it would have to be a younger one, and they would need some time to discuss it with their husbands. Nobody had offered to do anything about the building. Victor Porter came to Harlan's Crossing in the middle of November like a man arriving to inspect a purchase he was confident would be waiting for him. He was somewhere in his 50s, thick through the middle, dressed better than the weather warranted, and had the particular manner of a man who had spent long enough getting what he wanted that he'd stopped being able to imagine the alternative. He stopped in front of the orphanage on his first day in town and looked at it. Just looked, the way you look at something that belongs to you in every way except the paperwork. Evelyn happened to be coming up the porch steps with a load of laundry when he did this. Their eyes met. Porter tilted his hat, which was a gesture that managed to communicate both politeness and dismissal at the same time. "Miss Harper," he said. "Victor Porter. I believe you know my name." "I do," she said. "I want you to know there's no personal animosity in this," he said. "It's a sound investment. The building is structurally solid, the location is excellent, and Harlan's Crossing is going to grow. The hotel will bring commerce to this town." "I'm sure it will," she said. "I've been in contact with the county welfare office regarding the children," he said. "There are arrangements that can be made. These things can be handled with dignity." "The children are not a thing to be handled," she said. He looked at her the way people look at someone making a point he's heard before and found unpersuasive. "I understand your attachment," he said. "I do. But attachment isn't a legal argument." He went on his way. Evelyn stood on the porch with the laundry and watched him go and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. That evening, she told Garrett about the encounter without dramatizing it because she'd learned that dramatizing things you couldn't change was a waste of energy you needed for other things. Garrett listened. He didn't say much. His jaw had gone tight in a way she'd started to recognize. "He's spoken to the county welfare office," she said. "I heard. They have a place in Cotter County. Takes children from broken situations, farms them out to families for labor." She said it flatly. "Clara's 4 years old, Garrett. What family wants a 4-year-old for labor?" He set his coffee cup down very carefully. "What about the children nobody wants to take?" she said. "What about Thomas? He's 16. He's angry, and he's difficult, and he's brilliant, and nobody wants a 16-year-old boy with an attitude. What happens to Thomas?" "Nothing's going to happen to Thomas," Garrett said. "You don't know that." "I know I'm not going to let it happen to Thomas." She looked at him. He looked back. He meant it. She could tell that much. But meaning it and having a way to do it were different things, and she was tired enough that she said, "With what, Garrett? What are you going to do?" He didn't answer, but something in his face had changed, a kind of settling, like a decision arriving. She didn't push it. She was too tired to push anything. The last door closed on a Wednesday. Evelyn had spent 3 days working through every legal and financial angle she could find, had talked to the only lawyer in Harlan's Crossing, a man named Aldridge who was decent but cautious, had written letters to 2 county commissioners, had gone back to the town council. She'd gotten nowhere. The sale was legal. Porter had the money and the right to spend it. Aldridge had said gently that the most she might realistically manage was a delay of a few weeks on procedural grounds, not a reversal. She walked home from Aldridge's office in the early afternoon with the sky pressing down gray and low and the wind cutting through the gap in her coat where the top button had come off 2 weeks ago, and she hadn't found time to sew it back. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried about the orphanage in years. She'd learned early that crying used energy she needed for other things, and besides, there was nobody to cry to. She walked home and went through the front door and stood in the kitchen and looked at the pot on the stove and the shelf above the window where 15 cups hung in a row. 15 cups. One for each child, one for herself. She stood there for a while looking at the cups. Then she reached up and took down the cup at the end of the row and held it for a moment, and then she put it back on the shelf with a 16th cup beside it. One she'd kept in the cabinet, a plain brown ceramic one without any particular history, and hung it on the hook. 16 cups. She stood back and looked at the row. Then she went and started supper. Garrett didn't come that evening, or the next. She told herself she didn't notice and almost managed it. On the second night, she was sitting with Thomas after the younger children were in bed, the 2 of them playing cards at the kitchen table. Thomas played cards the way he did everything, with careful attention and a studied expression that was supposed to communicate that he didn't care about the outcome. Evelyn had learned to read the tells. "You think he's going to fix it?" Thomas said, not looking up from his hand. She didn't pretend not to know who he meant. I don't know. But you think he's trying? She looked at her cards. Yes, she said. I think he's trying. Thomas laid down a card. He's different, he said. Most grown men who come around here, they're doing it so they can feel good about themselves. You can tell. He paused. He's not like that. No, Evelyn said. He's not. He's just... Thomas struggled with it. He's just here, like it's a normal thing. Yes. Thomas won the hand and reorganized his cards and didn't say anything else about it, but his jaw had lost some of its set tension, and that meant something, from Thomas. Evelyn lay awake that night for a long time. She had 60 days, and 30 of them were gone. She did not know what Garrett was doing in his absence. She did not know if the things she'd started to understand about the 16 cups on the shelf was something she should name or leave unnamed a while longer. She did not know how to be a person who let help in without holding her breath against the moment it got taken back. What she knew was 14 children sleeping above her, Clara and her rabbit, Thomas and his cards, Pete and his horses, the 10 others with their particular hungers and stubbornnesses and small, brave interior lives. She knew that the building cost $1,100 to buy outright, which she had looked up in the county property records. She knew that $1,100 was an amount she could not imagine assembling from nothing in 30 days. She knew that somewhere north of town, on a ranch he had built with 16 years of his own hands, a man was sitting with something that looked like a decision. She turned the lamp down and lay in the dark. The wind came in off the ridge and pushed against the house, and the house held. 30 days left. Porter's lawyer filed the formal acquisition papers with the county clerk on a Monday morning, and the final sale date was announced publicly, January 1st at 11 in the morning. The auction to finalize the transfer, a legal formality since Porter was the only registered bidder, would take place in the county clerk's office. Evelyn heard about it from Aldridge, who stopped by the orphanage that afternoon looking like a man delivering news he didn't enjoy delivering. It's done then, she said. Legally, the process is complete. Unless another bidder comes forward before the auction date, Porter takes the building January 1st. He paused. I'm sorry, Miss Harper. I genuinely am. I know you are, she said. He left. She went back inside. The children knew something was wrong. Children always know. They have sensors for adult distress that are finely calibrated from years of needing to read rooms correctly. They didn't ask directly, which meant they'd already decided the answer was something they didn't want confirmed. Thomas came and found her that evening in the kitchen. How much time? He said. She told him. He stood there with the set jaw and the careful eyes, and she watched him work through the math in the way a 16-year-old works through a problem that turns out to have no good solution. Okay, he said finally. Thomas, I'm fine, he said, which was the sentence he said when he was not fine. He went back upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. When the knock came at the door, it was late, and for a moment she didn't move, because she was tired down to something under the bone, and she wasn't sure she had anything left for whoever was on the other side. But she got up and opened the door. Garrett was standing on the porch. The temperature had dropped hard. His breath came in short, white clouds, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the usual steadiness, something older than that. Something that had been arrived at through difficulty. He took his hat off. Can I come in? He said. Of course, she said. He came in and stood in the kitchen and didn't sit down right away. She poured coffee she'd kept warm and set it in front of him and sat across from him and waited. He looked at the row of cups on the shelf above the window. She watched him count them. He looked at her. 16, he said. 16, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. She folded her hands on the table and waited. I went out and walked the double C this morning, he said. All of it. Every pasture, every fence line, the south water, the north cut. Took me most of the day. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It's good land. I put 16 years into it, and it's genuinely good land. The cattle are in solid shape, the horses are well bred, the buildings are sound, and a buyer would get something real. She was very still. Aldridge gave me a number last week, he said, when I asked him, privately. The building plus the property. He met her eyes. My ranch, everything in it, the livestock, the equipment, the land, is worth enough. Maybe a little more than enough. The kitchen was very quiet. Garrett, she said carefully, what are you telling me? I'm telling you I'm going to sell the double C, he said, and I'm going to go to that auction on January 1st, and I'm going to buy this building. She looked at him for a long moment. You can't do that, she said. I can. It's your ranch. You built that with 16 years of your life. I know what I built it with. Garrett, I told you I needed you to hear all of it, he said, not unkindly. She stopped. I don't have a family, he said. I have a very good ranch, and I have enough money that I can probably get through the rest of my life without difficulty if I'm careful, and when I die, the double C will go to, I don't know, someone, a cousin I've met twice, some legal process. He paused. I have been trying to explain to myself for the last week why that makes more sense than this, and I can't. That's not a reason to destroy everything you have, she said, and she heard her own voice crack slightly, which she hadn't expected. It's not going to be destroyed, he said. It's going to go to someone who'll work it. The land doesn't care who owns it. He looked at her steadily. These children care who's here. She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. She was not going to cry. Where would you go? She asked. If you sold everything, where would you go? I'd have enough left for a small place. There's a cabin north of town, past the Miller Road fork. It's not much, but it's enough for a man who doesn't need much. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The lamp between them was burning low, and the house was quiet, and outside the wind pushed cold against the walls. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. This isn't... He stopped, and for a moment she saw the difficulty in it, the thing he was trying to say that didn't have an easy shape. I just can't leave them here to lose this. I can't do it and live with myself afterward. That's the whole of it. She looked at the 16 cups on the shelf. She thought about Clara's rabbit, Pete's breathless inventory of horse names, Thomas saying he's just here like it's a normal thing. She looked back at Garrett. When did you decide? She said. Tuesday, he said, when I saw the auction notice. She nodded slowly. How long will the sale take? I've already talked to 2 buyers, he said. One of them wants the whole operation. We can close before January 1st. She sat with that for a long moment. You're serious, she said. I'm always serious, and he said. She almost smiled. She didn't quite. I know, she said. That's what worries me. He looked at her with something that was patient and direct and did not ask her for anything. She looked back at him and thought about the woman she'd been 11 years ago, 23 and furious and absolutely certain that she could do this alone because she had to. And the woman she'd become, who still believed that, but was beginning to understand that believing something because you have to and believing it because it's true are occasionally different things. All right, she said finally. He nodded. All right, he said back. That was all. He drank his coffee. She poured herself a cup and drank hers. The house settled around them in the cold, and somewhere above them 14 children slept in the home they didn't know yet they were going to keep. He finished his coffee and set the cup down, and she refilled it without asking, which was something she'd started doing without noticing when she'd started doing it. That was the thing about Garrett Cole that she was still working out, the way he'd inserted himself into the ordinary rhythms of the place so gradually that she couldn't point to a specific moment when he'd become part of them. He was just there, the way a good stove is just there. You only notice it when it stops working. She didn't say any of that. She poured his coffee and sat back down, and they talked for another hour about practical things. The timeline for the ranch sale, who the likely buyers were, what documentation Aldridge would need for the property transfer. Practical things were easier. Practical things had steps you could follow. He left around 10 o'clock. She stood on the porch and watched his horse move down the road in the dark, and then went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a long moment looking at nothing. 16 cups. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. The news moved through Harlan's Crossing. The way news always moved through Harlan's Crossing, faster than it had any right to and with details attached that nobody could quite source. By Thursday of that week, most of the town knew that Garrett Cole was selling the double C. By Friday, most of them knew why. The reactions were what Evelyn had come to expect from a town that was decent in the way that small towns are decent, genuinely, and within certain limits that nobody had ever explicitly agreed on, but everyone seemed to understand. Margaret Holt, who ran the dry goods store and was the unofficial keeper of Harlan's Crossing's social ledger, stopped Evelyn on the street Saturday morning with the expression of someone delivering a piece of information they found both significant and slightly concerning. "People are talking," Margaret said. "People talk," Evelyn said, "about you and Mr. Cole." Margaret paused, clearly waiting for a response that would either confirm or deny the thing she'd already decided. Evelyn looked at her. "Mr. Cole has been generous to the orphanage," she said. "I'm grateful for his help." "He's selling his ranch, Evelyn." "I know." "That's not—" Margaret lowered her voice, though they were standing in the middle of the street with nobody particularly close. "That's not just generosity. That's a man who has a personal interest." Evelyn thought about Garrett sitting at the supper table, reading a story about a river expedition to Pete and Clara and the 3 younger girls who'd pushed onto the bench beside him. She thought about Thomas and the window latch. She thought about the way he'd said, "I just can't leave them here to lose this." "He has an interest in the children," she said. "As do I. That's the whole of it." Margaret looked at her with the particular expression of someone who believes they see a situation more clearly than the person in it. "People will talk more," she said, "about propriety, about what it looks like." "I've been running this orphanage for 11 years, Evelyn said. "People have been talking for most of them. I found that doing the actual work tends to take up most of the time I might otherwise spend worrying about the talking." She smiled, which was not warm exactly, but was not hostile either. "Good morning, Margaret." She walked on. She told herself the conversation didn't bother her, and it bothered her a little. Not because Margaret was necessarily wrong about what people were saying, but she was probably right, and it would only get worse once the sale went through. What bothered her was the particular flavor of the concern, the way it dressed itself as care while actually being about something else, about whether Evelyn Harper was behaving correctly, about whether a woman in her position had any business letting a man like Garrett Cole get close, about the orphanage's reputation, which some people apparently felt they had a stake in, even though they'd never once offered to help pay for lamp oil. She went home and started the day's baking and didn't mention it to anyone. Garrett came that evening with a load of potatoes from his root cellar and the news that the first buyer, a rancher from 2 counties east named Bill Stanhope, had come out to look at the Double C and was serious. "How serious?" Evelyn asked. "Made an offer this morning." He set the potato sack down on the kitchen floor with a thud. "It's under what I need." "How far under?" "200 short of the building price, plus what we talked about for operating costs." He straightened up. "There's a second man coming out Sunday, Elias Crane. He's been looking to expand for 2 years. His operation's healthy. He might come in higher." She nodded. She was thinking about the $200 and what it meant if Crane didn't come through, and she could tell from Garrett's face that he was thinking about the same thing. "There's the livestock on top of the land price," she said. "The horses alone." "That's already in Stanhope's number," he said. "He wants the full operation. Everything." "What about your personal horses? Hector?" He was quiet for a moment. "Hector goes with the rest." She looked at him. He was looking at the potatoes. "Pete doesn't know yet," she said carefully. "No." He picked up the empty sack and folded it. "Let me get the building first. Then Pete can know about Hector." There was something in his voice when he said it. Not self-pity, nothing like that. Just a plain acknowledgement of cost. The way you say something hurts when you're not asking for sympathy, just marking the truth of it. Evelyn thought about Pete's face when he talked about the horses, about the way he'd listed all 12 names once from memory and then done it again in a different order like it was a song he was learning. "I'll tell him when the time comes," she said. "I'll do it." Garrett looked at her. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said. "He'll take it better from me." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. He sat down at the table and she poured coffee and they went over the numbers again, the way they'd been going over the numbers for a week, looking for anything they'd missed. There was nothing they'd missed. It was going to be close. Thomas came down for a glass of water and found them at the table with papers spread between them and stood in the doorway for a moment reading the room. "Stanhope lowballed you," Thomas said to Garrett. Garrett looked up. "How do you know about Stanhope?" Pete heard you talking to Evelyn about the buyers last week and told me. Thomas poured his water. He's been lowballing people in this county for years. My grandfather sold him a pasture when I was little and said he got cheated. Your grandfather may have been right, Garrett said. That's why there's a second buyer coming Sunday. Thomas leaned against the counter with his glass. Elias Crane. Garrett studied him. You know Crane? He bought the Whitmore parcel 2 years ago, paid 3 cents over asking. Thomas shrugged, which was how he delivered information he clearly thought was valuable. He doesn't like to lose deals. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That's useful, he said. Thomas finished his water and went back upstairs. At the top of the stairs he paused. She could hear him stop. And then he came back down 2 steps and said, without looking at them, Crane'll go high if he thinks Stanhope's still in it. Then he went back upstairs. Evelyn and Garrett looked at each other across the table. He's not wrong, Garrett said. No, she said. He's usually not. She looked toward the stairs. He's going to be something, that boy. He already is, Garrett said. He just doesn't know it yet. Sunday came cold and clear, the kind of November day that looks almost forgiving until you step outside and remember. Evelyn didn't go to the Double C for the meeting with Crane. There was no reason for her to be there and several reasons for her not to be. But she found herself glancing at the clock in the kitchen more than she needed to and keeping herself busy with tasks that required just enough attention to keep her mind occupied. She put the younger children to work on a batch of cornbread and spent an hour helping Clara practice letters on a slate, which Clara approached with the concentrated ferocity she brought to everything. Eat, Clara said. Good. That's your letter. It is, Evelyn said. Keep going. V, Clara said, drawing it slowly. V is a bird. Why is V a bird? Because it looks like wings. Clara held up the slate. See? Evelyn looked. I see, she said. That's actually very perceptive. Clara was pleased with herself in the direct, uncomplicated way that 4-year-olds have before the world starts teaching them to hide it. She bent back over the slate. Garrett arrived at 4 in the afternoon. He came through the door and stood in the kitchen, and she read his face before he said anything and felt the tight thing in her chest ease slightly. He came in above asking, Garrett said. Buy enough. She let out a breath. How much above? He told her. It was enough. Enough for the building, enough for a cushion, enough for the cabin north of town, and not much else. He wants to close before Christmas, Garrett said, which means the paperwork has to move fast. Aldridge can move fast, she said. That's what I thought. He sat down. He looked tired in a way he hadn't shown before. Not worn out, but hollowed a little. The way you look when something you've been deciding is finally decided, and the deciding is done, and what's left is just doing the thing. It's real now. Yes, she said. I mean, I knew it was real, but there's knowing and there's... I know, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She understood what he was talking about because she'd had a version of that feeling 11 years ago when she'd made the decision to stay in Harlan's Crossing and run Edmund Ames's orphanage instead of going east where she'd been accepted to a teaching position. Knowing something and feeling it become real were different things, and the gap between them was sometimes wider than you expected. You can still change your mind, she said. She said it because she had to, not because she wanted to. Up until the papers are signed, you can still... I know I can, he said. I'm not going to. She nodded. She didn't push it further. Pete came crashing down the stairs at that point with the particular lack of physical caution that characterized Pete in all situations, and burst into the kitchen and stopped when he saw Garrett. Hector okay? Pete demanded. This was apparently the first question that came to him, which told Evelyn that Pete had figured out more of the situation than she'd realized. Garrett looked at him. Hector's fine. Why? Thomas said you were selling the ranch. Thomas is right. Pete's face went through several expressions in quick succession. He was 7 and hadn't yet learned to stack them in order. What about Hector? Hector goes with the ranch, Garrett said. He said it directly, which was the right call. Pete could handle hard news delivered straight. What he couldn't handle was being managed. Pete was quiet for a moment. But Hector's your horse. He is. Was. Garrett picked up his coffee cup. He'll be all right, Pete. Crane's operation is good. He'll be well looked after. But you won't see him. No, Garrett said, I won't. Pete thought about this. He had the kind of face that showed thinking plainly. You could watch the work of it. Finally, he said, That's really sad. Yeah, Garrett said, It is. Pete looked at him for a long moment, assessing. Then he crossed the kitchen and climbed onto the bench next to Garrett and leaned against his arm in the uncalculated way that young children make physical contact. Not a hug, just presence, weight, the animal comfort of being near something you trust. Garrett sat still. He didn't make a thing of it. He just let Pete lean against him and drank his coffee. Evelyn turned back to the stove. She stood there for a moment with her back to them, pressing her lips together once, then making herself be practical about supper. The whispers in town got sharper in the week after Crane's offer came through, because word got out faster than she'd hoped. By Tuesday, 3 separate people had made allusions, varying degrees of pointed, to the nature of Garrett Cole's involvement with the orphanage, with Evelyn specifically, and with what it all looked like. The most direct version came from Douglas Whitfield, who owned the feed store and sat on the town council and had been politely unhelpful to Evelyn throughout November. He stopped Garrett on the street Wednesday morning. She heard about it from Garrett that evening because Garrett told her things plainly rather than protecting her from them, which she appreciated even when the things were unpleasant. He said it was unseemly, Garrett said. A single man spending that much time at a household of women and children without a proper arrangement. Proper arrangement, Evelyn repeated. His words. What did you say? Garrett looked at his coffee. I said the children needed wood and the shutters needed fixing, and if Whitfield wanted to come over and do it himself, he was welcome to. He paused. He didn't think that was funny. Was it meant to be? Not particularly. She looked at the table. Is it going to be a problem for the sale? If enough of the right people decide to make noise about... No, he said, with a flatness that meant he'd already thought about this. The sale is between me, Crane, and Aldridge. It doesn't go through the council. Porter can complain all he wants about the auction, but if I show up with the money, the building goes to the highest bidder. That's the law. Porter will push back. Porter can push back from the street, Garrett said. He can't push back from inside the room. She wanted to believe that. She mostly did. But Victor Porter was a man who understood leverage, and leverage didn't always announce itself. Porter himself showed up at the orphanage door on a Thursday afternoon, which she hadn't expected, though in retrospect she should have. He came alone, which was either a sign of confidence or a tactical choice, and stood on the porch in his good coat with an expression that was working hard at sympathetic. Miss Harper, he said, I wanted to speak to you directly, woman to woman. I mean, as 2 people who want what's best for these children. Come in, she said, because she wasn't going to have this conversation on the porch where the children might hear. He came in. She did not offer him coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked around the kitchen with the eyes of a man pricing things. I'm aware of Mr. Cole's intentions regarding the auction, he said. Then you know what you're up against, she said. What I know, Porter said, is that a man selling his ranch and livelihood on an emotional impulse is not a stable foundation for 14 children. He folded his hands on the table. Let me speak plainly. I have the resources to make a proper arrangement for these children. A real facility, properly staffed and funded, in a location that can actually support that population. What I'm offering is not cruel. It's practical. What you're offering, Evelyn said, is to scatter them across 3 counties to families who want cheap labor. You've spoken to the Cotter County Placement Office. I know what that office does. Porter's expression shifted slightly. Some families are genuinely willing to provide good homes. Some, she said. And the ones who aren't? Clara is 4 years old. Thomas is 16. Do you know what happens to a 16-year-old boy who doesn't get taken anywhere? These are difficult realities. They are my realities, she said. They've been my realities for 11 years. You have had them for about 3 weeks. Porter looked at her. She looked back at him. He was a man who had gotten very used to rooms going his way. Mr. Cole is making a mistake, he said. Whatever his reasons, and I have my opinions about his reasons, he's trading 16 years of work for a building and a situation that will drain him dry within 2 years. I'm doing him a kindness by telling you this. I'll pass that along, she said flatly. Miss Harper. He leaned forward slightly. I will pay you 6 months' expenses in cash right now if you will simply not contest the sale. I'll give you time to make arrangements. That's more than fair." She looked at him. He was completely serious. She thought about what 6 months' expenses looked like in real numbers, what it would mean for flour and coal and lamp oil and shoes for the younger children who were growing out of theirs. She thought about it clearly and honestly, the way she thought about everything. Then she said, "No. Miss Harper, no," she said again. "Not for 6 months. Not for 6 years. This is not a transaction." She stood up. "I think you should go, Mr. Porter." He went, but at the door he turned and looked back at her with an expression that had lost the sympathetic overlay and showed what was underneath it, which was the look of a man who had encountered an obstacle he intended to remove. "The auction is a formality," he said. "You both know that. I have $40,000 behind this project. What does Cole have?" "Enough," she said. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment. She told him the truth. She believed it was enough. She also knew that Porter would find out the exact numbers before January 1st, because men like Porter always found things out. And if he found out how close the margins were, he might push the bidding past what Garrett had. She went to find paper and pen. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything she knew about the orphanage's finances, every asset, every debt, every liability, and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to Edmund Ames's lawyer in the county seat, a man named Harris, whom she had met once 3 years ago. Harris had handled Edmund's affairs for decades. She wrote the letter carefully, formally, laying out the situation and asking a single question: whether there were any provisions in Edmund's original estate documents regarding the orphanage, any stipulation, however small, that had not been addressed in the current sale proceedings. She sent Thomas to the post office with it the next morning. She didn't tell Garrett, not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't want to give him something to hope about that might come to nothing, and right now he had enough to carry. Well, the first week of December arrived with a snowstorm that came in off the northern ridge and dropped 8 inches overnight and made the world white and muffled and temporarily simple. The children, predictably, lost their minds. Even Thomas, who had maintained his careful composure through most of November and had clearly decided that maintaining composure was now a central part of his identity, ended up in the yard with a shovel that he'd started using to clear the porch, and then somehow was using to build the back wall of a fort, with Pete directing the engineering from inside what was either a very ambitious entrenchment or a catastrophic structural failure, depending on your perspective. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Clara was in the yard too, fully outfitted in a coat 2 sizes too large, donated the previous winter, the best they had, with the burlap rabbit tucked into her pocket for reasons of rabbit welfare. She was attempting to make a snow formation of some kind that defied easy categorization. Garrett arrived around mid-morning with more firewood and stood in the yard for a moment watching the situation assess itself. Pete saw him first. "Garrett, come look at our fort." "That's a fort?" Garrett said. "It's going to be," Pete said. "Thomas is making the wall." Garrett set down his load of wood and went to look at the wall, which Thomas was constructing with an engineer's focus and a 16-year-old's refusal to ask for input. Garrett studied it for a moment. "The corner's going to collapse," he said. Thomas looked at the corner. "No, it's not. The weight distribution is off. You need a brace on the inside here, or the east side goes down in an hour." Thomas looked at the corner again more carefully. He didn't say anything, but he started adding to the brace structure in a way that was clearly implementing what Garrett had said, without acknowledging that he was implementing it. Garrett went and got the firewood and brought it under the porch overhang and stacked it. When he came back, he walked past the fort construction and glanced at the corner. "Better," he said. Thomas said nothing, but his shoulders dropped about a 1/4 inch, which was Thomas for satisfied. Clara intercepted Garrett before he made it to the door. "Look," she said, pointing at the snow formation. Garrett looked at it. "What is it?" "It's Hector," Clara said. Garrett was very still for a moment. The snow formation was roughly horse-shaped in a way that required imagination and some goodwill, but the intent was completely clear. Clara had built 2 sticks into the front of it that were presumably legs and a lump at the top that was presumably a head. "She heard about the horse," Evelyn said quietly, appearing at Garrett's shoulder. She's been working on that for an hour. Garrett crouched down to Clara's level. That's a very good Hector, he said. Clara considered it critically. His legs are crooked. Hector's legs aren't always straight either, Garrett said. He walks kind of sideways when he's cold. Clara looked at him. Really? Really? So it's accurate, Clara said, which was a word she'd clearly picked up from somewhere and liked the weight of. It's accurate, Garrett agreed. Clara was satisfied. She went back to making adjustments to Hector's hindquarters. Garrett straightened up. Evelyn was standing next to him, both of them looking at the snow horse and the small, serious girl adjusting it. She's something, he said quietly. She is, Evelyn said. All of them are. She looked at him. He was looking at the yard. Pete arguing with Thomas about structural integrity, Clara sculpting. Two of the middle children throwing snow at each other in a way that would shortly escalate. With an expression she recognized because she had it herself sometimes, standing in this same spot, looking at the same scene. It was not a simple expression. It was something like wonder complicated by the knowledge that wonder is fragile. Garrett, she said. He looked at her. She almost said something she wasn't ready to say. She caught it and said something else instead. Thank you for today, for all the days. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face was steady and careful and held things it wasn't yet saying. You don't have to keep thanking me, he said. I know, she said. I'm going to anyway. He turned back to the yard. Fair enough, he said. Done. The letter from Harris came back in the second week of December. She read it twice at the kitchen table before letting herself understand what it said. Edmund Ames had written a provision into his will 11 years ago, at the time he established the orphanage. It was a small paragraph, easily overlooked, that Harris had passed over in the initial estate proceedings because it had appeared moot given the sale. The provision stated that in any transfer of the property, the operating trust of the orphanage, the legal entity under which the institution functioned, had a 60-day right of first refusal on any sale at assessed value. The orphanage trust had a 60-day right of first refusal. The clock had started November 1st. 60 days ended January 1st. She sat very still. The assessed value of the property was $940, $160 less than Porter had agreed to pay. Less than what Crane's sale would yield, less than what Garrett needed to sell everything for. Her hands were not quite steady when she put the letter down. She looked at the 16 cups on the shelf. She thought about the math, the assessed value, Garrett's sale proceeds, the operating cushion, what was left over. It was not comfortable. It was not generous, but it was possible in a way that hadn't existed 20 minutes ago. She got up and went to find Aldridge. Aldridge read the provision twice, then a third time, with the careful expression of a man who is making sure he's reading what he thinks he's reading before he says anything about it. It's valid, he said. It's small print, but it's valid. The trust has standing. Can we act on it? She said. Before January 1st, yes. He looked at her over the letter. The trust exercises the right at assessed value, which means Porter's offer is superseded. The trust buys the property at $940. He paused. Evelyn, the trust doesn't have $940. Not yet, she said. He looked at her. Mr. Cole's sale closes this week, she said. He was prepared to spend more than that. If the trust exercises first refusal at assessed value, we need less than he expected. Aldridge sat back. He was quiet for a moment, thinking through the shape of it. Porter will contest it, he said. On what grounds? The provision is in Edmund's own will. He'll find grounds. He has lawyers. Aldridge tapped the letter. But he'd be contesting a provision in a valid will, which is slow and expensive and not guaranteed. And by the time it resolved, the children would still be in the building, Evelyn said. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. He was a cautious man who had given her cautious advice for most of November and had been right to do so. Now he looked like a man doing a careful calculation. File the notice of first refusal this week, he said, before Porter has time to react. I'll draft the paperwork today. He paused. This doesn't mean it's over, but it changes the room. I know, she said. She walked home with Harris's letter folded in her coat pocket and the cold pressing in on all sides. and something she hadn't felt in a long time moving through her chest. Not hope exactly, because she'd learned to be careful with hope, but something close to it, something that had teeth. She found Garrett at the orphanage when she got back, in the middle of fixing a cracked window frame in the front room with Thomas handing him tools in a manner that had evolved over the past several weeks, from Thomas's studied indifference into something that looked a great deal like an apprenticeship, though neither of them would have used that word. She waited until they were done, and then she showed Garrett the letter. He read it again. $940, he said. At assessed value, she said. The trust has first refusal. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him do the math the same way she'd done it, running through what Crane's sale would yield and what $940 versus the higher building price meant in terms of what remained. He stopped. It's enough, she said. With some left over, not a lot, but some. For the cabin, he said. For the cabin, she agreed, and for operating costs, and for Clara's shoes. He looked at her. You'd still need to go through with the sale, she said. Crane, the ranch. That doesn't change. We still need the money. I know, he said. But it means Porter doesn't get to set the price. We do. He turned the letter over in his hands. He looked at it for a long moment, at Edmund Ames's provision and Harris's careful legal handwriting and the number $940 that had materialized out of an old man's small, cautious act of care for something he'd built. Edmund, he said quietly, almost to himself. Edmund, she agreed. Thomas had been listening from the doorway, which he would deny if asked. He looked from the letter to Garrett to Evelyn and back to the letter and said, Does this mean Porter doesn't get the building? Not if Aldridge files the paperwork this week, Evelyn said. Thomas absorbed this. His face went through the complicated work it always went through, and then settled into something that was cautiously, carefully, in the specifically Thomas way, almost like relief. Good, he said. Then he went back to collecting tools as if he hadn't said anything important. Evelyn looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Evelyn. File it, he said. I already told Aldridge to start the paperwork, she said. He almost smiled. Of course you did. Were you expecting me to wait? No, he said. I was not. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. The window frame was fixed. The front room was warmer than it had been. Outside, the snow from earlier in the week was still on the ground, and somewhere in the yard was Clara's snow horse, with his accurate crooked legs, starting to melt at the edges in the thin afternoon light. Aldridge filed the notice of first refusal on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, Victor Porter knew about it. Evelyn had expected that. What she hadn't expected was how fast Porter moved in response, because men with $40,000 behind them don't sit with bad news. They do something about it. Porter's lawyer, a man named Cresswell, who had come in from the county seat and had the clipped manner of someone accustomed to making problems disappear through paperwork, appeared at Aldridge's office Friday evening with a counterfiling that challenged the provision's validity on 3 separate grounds. Aldridge came to the orphanage Saturday morning to explain what that meant, and Evelyn sat across from him at the kitchen table and listened to the legal architecture of it with the particular focus she applied to things she couldn't afford to misunderstand. He's arguing the provision is unenforceable because Edmund failed to formally register the orphanage trust as a legal entity capable of holding property at the time the will was written, Aldridge said. It's not a frivolous argument. The trust documentation is old, and the registration process in this county was inconsistent in those years. Is he right? She said. Aldridge hesitated, which told her something. He has a point worth arguing. The provision is valid in intent. I believe that clearly. Whether it's valid in execution depends on how a judge reads the registration question. How long to get a judge's reading? In normal circumstances, 4 to 6 weeks. She looked at him. The auction is in 17 days, she said. I know, he said. She sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. The children were outside, Garrett wasn't there yet, and the house had the particular stillness of a Saturday morning when everyone had briefly scattered in different directions. Is there a faster way? She asked. I've already drafted an emergency injunction request, Aldridge said, asking the circuit judge to recognize the provision and halt the auction pending resolution. But Evelyn, An emergency injunction requires the judge to agree it's an emergency. Porter's lawyer will argue it's not. 14 children losing their home isn't an emergency? In legal terms, it depends on whether the judge believes there's irreparable harm that can't be addressed after the fact. Aldridge looked at her carefully. I think we have a reasonable argument. I do not think we have a certain one. She looked at the surface of the table. File the injunction, she said. I will. But you need to understand, we might lose it. And if we do, the auction proceeds on January 1st, and Mr. Cole's money becomes our only line. I understand, she said. File it anyway. But she told Garrett that evening. She told him straight, all of it. The counterfiling, the registration argument, the injunction, the odds as Aldridge had laid them out. She had gotten out of the habit of managing what she told him, sometime in the last 2 weeks. She wasn't sure when it had happened. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. So we might be back to the auction, he said. Yes. And if Porter finds out exactly what Crane's sale came in at, he can push the bidding. Yes. Garrett nodded slowly. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a man running calculations. The Crane sale closed Tuesday. Those numbers are in the county records by now. Porter will find them. I know. How much above Crane's number can Porter go before he's spending more on the building than it's worth as a hotel investment? She hadn't thought about it quite that way. She looked at him. The assessed value is $940, she said slowly. Crane's sale gave us more than that with the margin. Porter paid $1,500 for the lot next door last year, according to county records. He values this property at a hotel development, not residential. His ceiling is probably higher than mine, Garrett said flatly. Possibly. How much higher? She didn't answer because she didn't know, and not knowing was worse than a bad number. Garrett stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark yard. The snow from the storm 2 weeks ago had compressed into hard gray crust that caught the lamplight from the kitchen and threw it back in pieces. Then the injunction has to hold, he said. Yes. And if it doesn't, then we make the best case we can at the auction and see where Porter's ceiling actually is, she said. We don't know it's higher. We're guessing. Porter doesn't guess, Garrett said. He calculates. She knew he was right. She'd been thinking about it since Aldridge left, turning it over and looking at all the sides of it. There was a version of January 1st where the injunction held and Porter lost cleanly. There was a version where the injunction failed and Garrett's money was enough, and Porter walked away from a bidding war he hadn't budgeted for. And there was a third version that she was not going to describe out loud, but that sat in the back of her mind like a cold stone. I need to tell you something, Garrett said. He was still at the window. All right. The cabin north of town. The one I said I'd have enough left for. He turned around. I looked at it again this week. It's not in bad shape. It's small, and it needs work, but the structure is sound. Okay, she said, not sure where this was going. If the bidding goes higher than what Crane's sale gave me, he stopped. I can let the cabin go. Live in the bunkhouse here through the winter if you'd have me, and find something in the spring. She looked at him. Garrett, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly, and she recognized the speed of it. The same speed she used when she was explaining that something wasn't what it looked like before anyone had suggested it was. I'd sleep in the bunkhouse. It's just, if the margin gets tight, I don't want the cabin to be the reason we lose. She held his gaze for a moment. He was completely serious. He was telling her he would trade his last piece of ground for this, and he was doing it in the same flat, practical tone he used to talk about fence repairs. We're not there yet, she said. I know. I'm telling you in case we get there. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it costs a person to say something like that. Not the money part, but the other part, the asking to stay part, wrapped inside the practical language. The bunkhouse is drafty, she said finally. I've slept in worse. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. That was enough for him. She'd learned that about Garrett, that he didn't need more than what was offered. He didn't push for certainty when uncertainty was honest. The circuit judge's name was Albright, and he rode into Harlan's Crossing on the 22nd of December to hear the injunction argument in the county courthouse, which was also the post office and the recorder's office, and smelled permanently of old paper and boot leather. Half the town showed up, which nobody had officially announced would happen, and which happened anyway because Harlan's Crossing was the size of place where a courthouse hearing about the orphanage constituted the most interesting thing happening that week. The children didn't come. Evelyn had been very clear about that. This was not a spectacle, and she was not going to put them in a room where their futures were being argued about in legal language while strangers watched. Thomas had pushed back on this because Thomas pushed back on things on principle, but she'd been firm, and he'd accepted it with the particular gracelessness of someone who knows they've lost a reasonable argument. Garrett sat beside her at the table on the petitioner's side. Aldridge sat on her other side with his papers organized in a way that communicated competence without performance. Across the room, Cresswell had a younger lawyer with him who took notes and looked certain about things the way young lawyers do before experience teaches them better. Porter sat behind Cresswell, in the front row of the gallery, with his coat buttoned and his hands folded and the expression of a man who had done this before and was not particularly worried about the outcome. Evelyn did not look at Porter. Judge Albright was somewhere in his 60s, lean and direct, with a judge's particular economy of expression. He'd heard enough arguments to know the difference between the shape of a case and the noise around it, and he listened to Aldridge's presentation with the focused attention of someone doing actual work. Aldridge laid it out cleanly. Edmund Ames's provision, the 60-day right of first refusal, the orphanage trust standing, and the simple human reality that 14 children had 8 days before they lost their home if the auction proceeded. He didn't dramatize it. He let the facts carry the weight, which was the right call in front of a judge who'd seen too much drama to be moved by more of it. Cresswell's counter-argument was sharp and technically competent. The registration question was real. The trust documents from 11 years ago were imprecise in the way that small county paperwork from that era tended to be, and Cresswell knew how to make imprecision look like invalidity. He spent 15 minutes on it, methodical, not flashy, building the argument brick by brick. Then he said something Evelyn hadn't anticipated. Furthermore, Cresswell said, turning slightly toward the gallery in a way that felt calculated, we would note that the primary advocate for the exercise of this provision is a woman with a personal and arguably romantic attachment to the man providing the purchase funds. The integrity of the transaction itself is therefore in question. The room was very quiet. Evelyn felt Garrett go still beside her. She kept her own face even because she had learned a long time ago that showing reaction in rooms like this was giving something away. Aldridge started to respond, but Judge Albright held up one hand without looking away from Cresswell. You're questioning the integrity of the transaction on the basis of the petitioner's personal relationships, Albright said. His voice was flat and did not give away his direction. The financial arrangement involves a significant transfer from a private individual with an undisclosed personal interest in the outcome, Cresswell said. It raises questions the court should consider. Albright looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Aldridge. Counselor? Aldridge stood. The provision in Mr. Ames's will does not specify the source of funds. It specifies the trust's right to exercise first refusal at assessed value. Whether those funds come from donations, personal savings, or a third party acting in support of the institution is legally irrelevant to the provision's validity. He paused. The attempt to characterize Miss Harper's character as grounds for dismissing a valid legal provision is not an argument about the law. It is something else. Albright made a note. He looked at Cresswell. I'll address the registration question. The personal character argument you've raised is noted and will receive the weight it deserves. Something in his tone suggested what weight that was. It took Albright 40 minutes to review the documentation. The courtroom sat in the particular uncomfortable silence of people who are trying not to make noise and are therefore more aware than usual of all the small sounds they normally ignore. Porter did not move from his seat across the room. He sat with the stillness of someone who had decided to wait and see, which meant he wasn't as certain as he'd looked walking in. Evelyn noticed that and filed it. Albright came back with his notes and sat and looked at the room for a moment. The registration question raised by the respondent is technically valid, he said. The trust documentation from 11 years ago is imprecise. However, he looked at the papers in front of him. Edmund Ames operated this institution for 11 years under this trust. The county welfare records acknowledge the trust's operating authority. The county tax records assess the property with a notation of the trust's occupancy. Imprecise original registration does not negate 11 years of recognized operational standing. He set down his papers. The provision is enforceable. Cresswell was already on his feet. Your Honor, we would request... I'm going to issue a temporary injunction halting the January 1st auction, Albright said, speaking over him without raising his voice. Pending formal resolution of the right of first refusal exercise. The Orphanage Trust has 30 days to complete the purchase at assessed value. If the funds are not delivered to the county recorder within 30 days, the stay lifts and the original sale proceeds. He looked at both tables. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Aldridge said. Cresswell said something technical about appeals. Albright told him where to file it. The business part was done. The room exhaled. Evelyn pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her. She did not close her eyes. She looked at the grain of the wood and took one breath that was slower than the ones before it. Garrett's hand moved toward hers on the table, stopped just short of it, and withdrew. It was the smallest gesture, barely a gesture at all, and she registered it completely. She did not move her hand. Later, outside the courthouse in the cold gray afternoon, with people moving around them and talking and the town briefly louder than it usually was, Garrett stood next to her, and they didn't say anything for a moment. 30 days, she said. Crane's money clears this week, he said. We can have the funds to Aldridge before Christmas. She nodded. Porter came out of the courthouse behind them. He didn't stop, but he looked at them as he passed, at Garrett specifically, with the expression of a man revising his calculations rather than abandoning them. He's not done, Garrett said quietly. No, she said. He's not. She was right about that. 2 days before Christmas, Cresswell filed a formal appeal of Albright's ruling with the district court in the county seat, which didn't overturn the injunction but put a question mark over it that wouldn't resolve until after the 30-day window. And 2 days after Christmas, Porter made a move that was more direct. He went to 3 members of the town council and told them that if the orphanage prevailed, he would withdraw his interest in developing Harlan's Crossing entirely. The hotel, the associated investment, the commerce it would bring. It was not a legal argument. It was something older than law. Douglas Whitfield came to find Evelyn on the 28th of December with his hat in his hands and a careful expression and said he thought she should understand that the council would be meeting January 2nd to discuss the situation and that community interests had to be weighed. Community interests, she said. The town is growing, he said. Porter's investment would bring... I know what it would bring, she said. I also know that the council has no authority over a county court injunction, and I know that Edmund Ames built that building 30 years ago and ran it as an orphanage and left a provision in his will for exactly this situation. She looked at him. What are you asking me, Douglas? He had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'm asking if there's a version of this that doesn't put the council in a difficult position. The version where 14 children keep their home puts the council in no position at all, she said. The version where they don't is the one you should be uncomfortable about. He left. Garrett, who had been in the next room and had heard most of it, came to the kitchen doorway. Council meeting January 2nd, he said. It doesn't matter, she said. The injunction is the injunction. They can't vote it away. They can make enough noise to complicate the appeal. Let them make noise. She looked at him. We have Albright's ruling, Edmund's provision, and the money. Porter has an appeal that's going to take months and money he didn't budget for, and a town council that is going to remember in the spring that those 14 children are still here and voters have opinions about children. Garrett looked at her for a moment. You've thought all of that through. I've been thinking about nothing else for 2 months, she said. He leaned against the doorframe. Something in his expression was close to a smile, or at least the Garrett Cole version of one. You're going to be fine, he said. We, she said. He looked at her. We're going to be fine, she said. The words sat between them for a moment, plain and undecorated, and neither of them moved to take it back. Outside, the year was running out. The last days of December were pressing in cold and hard, and the orphanage stood against them the way it always had. Not easily, not without cost, but standing. The money cleared on the 23rd of December. Aldridge sent a boy to the orphanage with a note that said simply, Crane's funds confirmed, ready to transfer on your instruction. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of her apron and went back to peeling potatoes, because supper still needed making regardless of what else was happening. She told Garrett that evening. He was at the table with Pete, who had been working on a drawing of Hector from memory with a stub of charcoal and the intense focus of someone trying to preserve something before it faded. The drawing was recognizable as a horse, which was a better result than most 7-year-olds would manage. "Aldridge is ready," she said. Garrett looked up from Pete's drawing. He read her face. "Good," he said. "I'll go in the morning and authorize the transfer to the recorder's office." He nodded. Pete looked between them, sensing something significant had happened, but not sure what. "Did we win?" Pete asked. "Not yet," Evelyn said. "But we're close." Pete looked back at his drawing. "Hector's ears aren't right," he said, to nobody in particular. Garrett looked at the drawing. "They're a little high," he agreed. "Move them back toward the middle of the head." Pete erased with his thumb and tried again. Christmas came to the orphanage the way it always did, with more work than the day deserved and less money than the occasion wanted, and with the children working up a collective enthusiasm that didn't care about either of those things. The younger girls had made paper decorations out of every scrap of colored paper Evelyn could find, which wasn't much, so the decorations were primarily brown and cream with occasional small squares of red from an old seed catalog. Clara had overseen this project with the managerial energy she brought to everything, assigning tasks and rejecting substandard work with a ruthlessness that would have been alarming in a 4-year-old if it weren't also extremely effective. Thomas had cut a small pine from the tree line north of the property and dragged it back without being asked, which was the kind of thing Thomas did. Useful, deliberate, unannounced. He'd propped it in the corner of the front room and said nothing about it, and 3 of the younger children had immediately descended on it with the paper decorations and their considerable opinions. Garrett arrived on Christmas morning with a sack over one shoulder that he refused to explain until they were all in the front room together. He'd brought small things. A carved wooden horse for Pete, which Pete received with a reverence that suggested he understood exactly what the gesture meant. A set of watercolor paints for a quiet girl named Nell, who had been drawing on any surface that would hold a mark since she arrived at the orphanage 2 years ago. A pocket knife for Thomas, who turned it over in his hands twice, and then looked at Garrett with an expression that he quickly covered with his usual composure. "It's a good knife," Thomas said. "It's a working knife," Garrett said. "Not for showing, for using." Thomas nodded, which meant he understood the difference and appreciated being trusted with it. For Clara, there was a length of cloth, soft, brown, shaped deliberately into something that was meant to suggest a rabbit, a real one, not burlap. Clara held it against the burlap rabbit and looked between them with the solemn expression of someone making a diplomatic decision. "They can both stay," Clara announced. "That was my thinking," Garrett said. He'd brought Evelyn a pair of gloves, good ones, lined, the kind that actually kept the cold out. She looked at them for a moment. "My other pair has a hole," she said. "I noticed," he said. She put them on. They fit. She didn't say anything else about it, but she wore them the rest of the morning. It was not a large Christmas. It was not a comfortable one in the financial sense, with the appeal still hanging over the injunction and the January 2nd council meeting and Porter's shadow sitting at the edges of everything. But it was warm in the way that specific rooms on specific days are warm, not because of the stove, though the stove was working well, but because of the particular combination of people in the room and the fact that they were all, for this one morning, simply there. Evelyn watched Garrett sit on the floor with Pete and 3 of the younger children and help assemble something out of sticks and string that was supposed to be a fence for a small play farm they'd constructed from carved wooden pieces. He wasn't good at sitting still normally. She'd noticed that about him, the rancher's instinct to always be moving toward the next task. But he sat on the floor with the children and did not appear to be anywhere else. She thought about Edmund Ames's provision sitting in the county records, about $940 transferred to the recorder's office, about the injunction and the appeal and January 2nd. Then she looked at Clara in the corner, holding both rabbits, introducing them to each other with the gravity of a formal occasion. She thought, "We are still here." The council meeting on January 2nd was not what Whitfield had implied it would be. Evelyn went, because not going would have looked like concession, and she was not in the business of conceding. Garrett came with her. They sat in the 3rd row of the council chambers, which was a room above the feed store that smelled of sawdust and the particular tension of people who have brought their grievances to a formal setting. Porter was there. Cresswell was not. This wasn't a legal proceeding, but Porter had the composed confidence of a man who had done his preparation. Whitfield ran the meeting with the careful neutrality of someone trying to appear fair while leaning in a direction he'd already chosen. He explained at length the council's responsibility to weigh community interests. He noted the economic significance of Porter's proposed development. He used the phrase difficult situation 4 times in the first 10 minutes. Porter spoke for about 8 minutes. He was smooth and reasonable and made the hotel investment sound like something the town was being offered, not something he was trying to take from them. He mentioned jobs twice. He mentioned commerce 3 times. He did not mention the children at all, which Evelyn thought told you everything you needed to know about what he actually thought of the situation. Then he said, "We understand Mr. Cole and Miss Harper have formed a personal attachment, and while nobody wishes them anything but happiness, it would be irresponsible not to question whether an impulsive financial decision made under emotional circumstances represents a sound foundation for a children's institution." The room shifted slightly. A few people in the gallery leaned toward each other. Garrett, beside Evelyn, did not move. She did not look at him. She was watching the council members' faces, reading what they were registering. Whitfield said, "Miss Harper, you have the floor." She stood up. She did not have notes. She'd thought about bringing notes and decided against it, because this was not a room that needed to be persuaded by documentation. This was a room that needed to be reminded of something it already knew. "I've been here for 11 years, she said. "Most of you have been here longer. You know what this building is. You know what it's done. You know that when a family in this county couldn't keep their children and had nowhere else to go, Edmund Ames's orphanage was where those children went. Not the Cotter County Placement Office. Not some facility 2 days' ride away. Here." She looked at the council. Edmund Ames built that building and left a provision in his will that said this institution had the right to survive him. A judge has upheld that provision. The funds have been delivered. The legal process is complete, pending an appeal that Mr. Porter's attorney filed on grounds that a district court will take months to review. She paused. This council has no authority to reverse a circuit court ruling. What this council does have is a choice about what kind of town it wants to be, not in some large abstract sense, practically, specifically. January 1st, 14 children were supposed to lose their home. They didn't. That is either something this town stands behind or it isn't. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Whitfield conferred with the other 2 council members in the low murmur that public officials use when they're deciding how to say what they've already decided. Porter looked at the table. He had the expression of a man who had just watched a calculation go differently than he'd expected. The council did not vote to interfere with the injunction. They couldn't. Evelyn had been right about that. What they did vote was to formally acknowledge the circuit court's ruling and to enter into the record their recognition of the Orphanage Trust's legal standing, which was a bureaucratic gesture, but not a meaningless one. It put the council on record as not opposing the outcome, which made Porter's appeal politically more complicated than it had been an hour ago. Whitfield walked past them on the way out. He didn't stop, but he gave Evelyn a nod that acknowledged something. She wasn't sure exactly what. She nodded back. Porter left without speaking to anyone. Outside in the cold, Garrett stood beside her on the wooden sidewalk and looked at the empty street. "That was well done," he said. "It needed doing," she said. "You didn't tell me you were going to say all that." "I didn't know I was going to say all that until I was saying it." He looked at her with something that she had started to stop pretending she didn't recognize. "How are you doing?" he said, not asking about the council, asking about her. She thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said. "But okay." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The district court ruled on Porter's appeal on the 19th of January. The ruling came by post, a formal document in a county seal envelope that Aldridge brought to the orphanage himself, which was unusual enough that Evelyn's stomach tightened when she saw him coming up the porch steps. She took the envelope. Aldridge stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. She opened it and read it standing in the doorway. The district court had declined to overturn Albright's ruling. The provision was enforceable. The right of first refusal had been validly exercised. The transfer of the building to the Orphanage Trust was confirmed. She stood there for a moment. "It's over?" she said. Porter can appeal to the state level, Aldridge said. But the costs at that point would exceed what the property is worth to him as a development investment. He'd be paying lawyer fees for years to win a building he originally bought for $800. He paused. My honest opinion is he walks away. She looked at the document. It was dense with legal language that said, at its core, one thing: the building was theirs. Thank you, she said, for all of it. You worked harder on this than you had any obligation to. Aldridge looked mildly embarrassed, which was how he looked when something got close to sentimental. Edmund Ames was a good man, he said. He didn't have the right words in his provision, but he had the right idea. He put his hat back on. The deed will be formally transferred by end of week. I'll bring the documents. He went back down the steps. She stood in the doorway with the ruling in her hands. She heard the stairs creak, the third step, the one that always announced itself. And then Clara appeared at the bottom of the staircase in her nightgown, 2 rabbits in hand, looking at Evelyn with the directness that was her primary characteristic. Is it good news? Clara asked. Yes, Evelyn said. Clara considered this. Are we staying? Yes, Evelyn said. We're staying. Clara looked satisfied in the way she looked when something had been confirmed that she'd already decided to believe. She went back upstairs. Evelyn went to the kitchen and put the ruling on the table and sat down. She sat there for a while. She was not going to cry, and she didn't quite, though it was a closer thing than usual. Garrett came that afternoon, as he had come most afternoons for 2 months, and she showed him the document without preamble. He read it standing at the kitchen table. He set it down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Aldridge thinks Porter walks away from a state appeal, she said. Porter's a practical man, Garrett said. When the math stops working, he moves on. He looked at the document again. It's done. It's done, she said. He looked up at her. She looked at him. This was the moment when she understood, clearly and without the hesitation she'd been carrying since November, what the 16 cups on the shelf had meant when she put the 16th one up. She had known then, or had known something that she was only now willing to call by its actual name. She said, You sold everything you built. I know what I sold, he said, for a building you're not going to live in. I'm going to live in the cabin, he said, which is a very reasonable... Garrett, she stopped him. He waited. The cabin is a 20-minute ride from here, she said. You've been at this table every evening for 2 months. The children wait for the sound of your boots at the door. She paused. Pete named his carved horse Hector. Garrett looked at the table. I named that, she said, and pointed at the row of cups above the window. The 16th cup. Before I knew what you were going to do. Before the crane sale. Before the courthouse. She looked at him directly. I put it up because it was already true. He was very still. I'm not good at this, she said. I want to be honest about that. I've been alone long enough that I've gotten used to it, and I don't know how to... I'm not easy to live with, probably. I have opinions about how the kitchen should run that are firm and occasionally unreasonable. I don't sleep well, and I worry about things I can't control, and I've been carrying this place so long by myself that I don't always know how to put things down. I know, he said. I'm telling you the real version, she said, not the version that sounds good. I know you, he said. I've been sitting at your table for 2 months. I know the real version. She looked at him. I'm not easy either, he said. I go quiet when I should say things. I'm slow to trust and slow to let go once I've decided something, and I've been so used to running everything by myself that I sometimes forget to ask when I should. He paused. We'd make each other crazy sometimes. Yes, she said. Probably. I sold the ranch because those children needed a home, he said. That's true. And it's also true that I drove out to this place the first time in November and sat at your table and went home and thought about it for 3 days before I came back. And what I was thinking about wasn't the children. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, What were you thinking about? You, he said. The way you run this place. The way you talk to them. Not soft, not performing, just honest. The way you didn't ask me why I was here or what I wanted. He looked at her steadily. I've been a long time not knowing what I was building all this for. And then I sat at your table and I thought, there it is. She pressed her hands flat on the table. The cabin's 20 minutes, she said. I know. That's a long ride in the winter. It is, he said. Especially for someone who's going to be here every evening anyway, she said. He looked at her. Evelyn, I'm not proposing to you, she said quickly. I'm making an observation about geography. The corner of his mouth moved. That's what you're doing. It is. All right, he said. But she stopped, started again. If someone were going to propose, I would say yes. I'm telling you that in advance so the geography observation has its full context. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face, the careful, steady guardedness he wore most of the time, shifted into something underneath it, something that was the same quality but warmer. Context appreciated, he said. She looked at the table. That was embarrassing. No, it wasn't, he said. It was you. Outside, Pete was shouting something at Thomas about the structural integrity of a snow fort that had apparently collapsed, and Thomas was responding with the weary authority of someone who had predicted exactly this outcome. Clara's voice rose above both of them, making a pronouncement about something in a tone that suggested the situation was now under her management. Garrett looked towards the window. Evelyn looked at the cups on the shelf. The afternoon light was thin and low and winter pale, coming through the glass at a flat angle that turned the kitchen amber and slow. You're going to need a new fence on the north side of the yard before spring, he said. The posts are rotting. I know, she said. I've been putting it off. I'll look at it tomorrow, he said. All right, she said. He poured himself the last of the coffee. She got up to make more because there were still several hours of afternoon left and the children would be inside soon, cold and hungry and full of opinions, and the day would keep going whether the feeling in the room was named or unnamed. It was enough for now to be in the same kitchen, to know the fence needed fixing and that he would fix it, to know the cups were on the shelf and the building was theirs, and the third step still creaked and would probably always creak, and nobody was going anywhere. He fixed the north fence on a Thursday, the way he said he would. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window for a while. Not in the way she'd watched him that first morning in November when he was a stranger unloading firewood, and she didn't know what to make of him. This was different. This was the watching you do when someone has become part of the landscape of your days, and you've stopped being careful about noticing them. Thomas was out there too, digging post holes in the frozen ground with the focused misery of someone who had volunteered for a task and was now committed to not complaining about it. Garrett hadn't asked him to help. Thomas had just appeared with a shovel, which was becoming a pattern with Thomas, doing the thing without announcing he was going to do it, as if the announcement was the part he couldn't manage, not the work itself. Pete was sitting on the porch railing watching and offering commentary that neither of them asked for, and both of them were apparently ignoring with practiced patience. Clara was inside at the kitchen table, instructing Nell on the correct way to hold a paintbrush. Nell, who was 10 and had been painting since she got the watercolors at Christmas, and had already produced 7 small works of varying ambition, was accepting the instruction from a 4-year-old with the grace of someone who understood that Clara's authority was non-negotiable and resistance was exhausting. Evelyn turned away from the window and went back to bread dough. She had been thinking about the proposal conversation, or the not-quite-proposal conversation, the geography observation conversation, since it happened 4 days ago. She'd replayed it more than she'd admit, with the particular attention you give to something you want to make sure you remember correctly. What Garrett had said, the way he'd said it. I sat at your table and I thought, there it is. She had spent 11 years being careful. Careful with money, careful with hope, careful with anything she couldn't afford to lose. It was not a bad way to run an orphanage. It was a hard way to run a life. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. The door opened and Pete came in, red-faced from cold, stomping snow off his boots with more force than necessary. Thomas hit his thumb with the hammer, Pete reported. Is it bad? He said a word I'm not supposed to know. Go get the cloth from the medicine shelf, she said. The white one. Pete disappeared and came back with the cloth, and then went back out to deliver it, clearly pleased to be the official messenger between the porch and the kitchen. A few minutes later, Thomas came in holding his left hand with his right, the cloth wrapped around his thumb, wearing an expression of extreme dignity. Does it need looking at? Evelyn said. No, Thomas said. Let me see. It's fine. Thomas. He extended the hand with the resigned air of someone who has learned that resistance on medical matters costs more energy than compliance. She unwrapped the cloth and looked at the thumb. It was bruised, and the nail was going to turn dark, but nothing was broken. "You'll live," she said. "I know I'll live," he said. "Then stop looking like a man facing execution and go drink something warm." He sat down at the table. Clara assessed his injury with the clinical interest of someone considering whether this constituted a disruption to her painting lesson, decided it didn't, and went back to instructing Nell. Thomas watched Garrett through the window, who had continued setting posts without commentary on Thomas's absence. "He didn't say anything," Thomas said. "When I hit it." "No," Evelyn agreed. "He wouldn't." Thomas turned the cloth over in his good hand. "Most men would have laughed." "Garrett's not most men," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to marry him?" She kept her hands in the dough. "That's a direct question." "You've been thinking about something for 4 days," Thomas said. "You get a specific face when you're thinking about something. It's the same face you had before you went to see Aldridge about the Harris letter." She looked at him. He looked back at her, 16 years old and insufferably perceptive. "I don't know yet," she said, which was partly true, and partly the version she was still building the courage to stop telling herself. Thomas nodded like this was an acceptable answer for now. "He'd be good at it," he said. "He's already doing it." She looked at the window. Garrett was tamping a post into the ground with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did. "Yes," she said. "He is." He proposed 4 days later, which was the 27th of January, on a Tuesday evening after supper when most of the children had gone upstairs and the kitchen had settled into the quiet that followed a full table. He did not get down on one knee. He did not make a speech. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with his coffee in his hands and said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the building or the situation or because it makes practical sense, though it does make practical sense. Because I want to. Because you're the most..." He stopped. Started again. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like something I memorized, and I can't, so I'm just going to say it plain. You're the person I want to be around. You're the person I want to talk to at the end of the day. You and these children and this table and this kitchen, this is what I want my life to be. That's all I have." She looked at him. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "Garrett," she said. "Yes." He exhaled once, which was the only indication that he'd been holding something. "That was quick," he said. "I told you it would be," she said. "I told you in advance." "I thought that might have been a geographical hypothetical." "It wasn't." He looked at her across the table with the steady dark eyes that she'd been reading for 3 months now and was still finding new things in. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not a performance of it, just his hand on her hand on the table between their coffee cups. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while. Upstairs, Pete fell off something. There was a thud and a pause, and then his voice saying, "I'm fine," at a volume that suggested he was mostly fine. And the moment did what moments do, which is keep moving. "We should tell them," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Let tonight be tonight." She didn't argue with that. She told them at breakfast because breakfast was the meal where everyone was present and still too sleepy to perform reactions. They just had them. The younger children's response was immediate and uncomplicated. Pete threw both arms in the air. 3 of the middle girls made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a shriek. And Clara looked from Evelyn to Garrett and back to Evelyn with a 4-year-old's complete unsentimental practicality and said, "Does this mean he lives here now?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Good," Clara said, and went back to her oatmeal. Garrett caught Evelyn's eye across the table. She pressed her lips together to keep from laughing, which was something she'd been doing more often lately, and which she suspected was going to become permanent. Thomas was at the end of the table. He hadn't said anything. He was eating with the careful focus of someone deciding how they felt about something before they expressed an opinion on it. After breakfast, when the younger children had scattered in every direction, and Garrett was in the yard looking at a section of porch railing that had started to give, Thomas came to find Evelyn in the kitchen. "It's good," he said. He said it to the window rather than to her, which was how Thomas said things that were difficult to say directly. "I think so too," she said. "He's not going to try to be..." Thomas paused. He's not going to come in here and act like he's in charge of everything. No, she said. That's not who he is? Thomas looked at the yard where Garrett was pressing on the railing post to test its integrity. He asked me, Thomas said, last week. He asked if I'd have a problem with it. Evelyn went still. He asked you. He said he wasn't asking permission because it wasn't mine to give, but he wanted to know. Thomas's voice was carefully even, the way he made his voice when something had gotten to him. He said I'd been the man of this place for long enough that it mattered what I thought. She looked at the back of Thomas's head. What did you tell him? She said. I told him the porch railing needed fixing, Thomas said. Thomas. And that if he made you unhappy, I'd have opinions about it. What did he say to that? Thomas's mouth moved into something that was close to a smile, close enough that she could see the shape of it even from the side. He said that was fair, Thomas said. She stood there for a moment. She had spent a long time, most of her adult life, carrying things that were heavy because there was nobody else to carry them. She hadn't thought of it as suffering, exactly. It was just the shape of the work. You picked up what needed picking up, and you went. And somewhere in that going, she had gotten so accustomed to the weight that she'd stopped being able to imagine what it felt like without it. She was beginning to learn. They married in February, on a Saturday when the cold had broken slightly and the sky was the particular pale blue of winter giving a small amount of ground. Aldridge performed the civil ceremony, which he was authorized to do and agreed to with the warmth of a man who felt he'd earned the right to witness a good outcome. The children were all present, which meant the ceremony had a certain amount of ambient noise, and at one point Clara dropped a rabbit, the new cloth one, and there was a brief interruption while it was retrieved from under the bench. Garrett stood beside Evelyn in his best coat, which was not particularly impressive, but was clean and pressed and clearly represented effort. She wore her blue dress, the one she saved for serious occasions, and the gloves he'd given her at Christmas, which she'd worn so often since then that they already looked lived in. He said what he had to say. She said what she had to say. They were not elaborate vows. They were the honest version, the working version, the kind that would hold up not on a perfect day, but on an ordinary difficult Thursday when the stove was acting up, and someone was sick, and the accounts didn't balance, and two people still had to choose each other anyway. When it was done, Pete started clapping, and 3 of the other children joined immediately, and Thomas did not clap, but he stood up, which was the Thomas version of a standing ovation. Claire examined the proceedings with the air of a senior official confirming that the paperwork was in order. "That's it?" she said. "That's it," Evelyn said. "Okay," Clara said. Victor Porter left Harlan's Crossing in March. He didn't make an announcement. He just stopped being there. His rented rooms at the boarding house were vacated, his lawyer Cresswell was no longer seen in the county clerk's office, and the appeal to the state court was formally withdrawn on the 14th of March, which Aldridge confirmed to Evelyn by post with a note that said simply, "It's finished. Congratulations." Evelyn read the note at the kitchen table and then put it in the box where she kept the important documents: Edmund's provision, Albright's ruling, the district court decision, the deed with the Orphanage Trust's name on it, and closed the lid. She thought about Porter for a moment, not with triumph, which wasn't an emotion she had a lot of patience for, and not with sympathy exactly, but with the particular understanding that comes from watching someone be wrong about what they thought they were entitled to. Porter had come to Harlan's Crossing with money and plans, and the reasonable expectation that money and plans were sufficient. He hadn't calculated for an 11-year-old institution with an obscure legal provision and a woman who had been running on determination and cornmeal for long enough that she'd stopped knowing how to stop. She didn't think he was a villain entirely. He was a man who had gotten used to rooms going his way and had not prepared himself for one that didn't. She'd met a dozen men like him. She didn't wish him ill. She just wished him elsewhere, which is where he now was. She closed the document box and went back to the bread. Spring came the way spring comes in hard country, tentative, unconvincing at first, then suddenly and almost aggressively real. Garrett moved his 2 remaining horses onto the property in April. He'd kept them back from the crane sale. Not Hector, he hadn't been able to manage that, but 2 mares he'd bred himself and felt responsible for. They were good horses, both of them, and they settled into the small paddock he built on the north side of the property as if they'd always been there. Pete named them immediately. He named the gray one Hector Jr., which was logistically complicated since Hector Jr. was a mare and approximately 12 years younger than the original Hector, but Pete had decided and the name stuck. The chestnut he named Dorothy, which was the name of a girl in his school whom he claimed he did not like, which told you everything you needed to know about Pete. Garrett taught Pete to brush them down on Saturday mornings, which became a ritual that Pete defended with the territorial ferocity of someone who has claimed a thing. If anyone else reached for the brush, Pete appeared from whatever corner of the property he'd been occupying and materialized beside the horse with an expression of mild but firm objection. Thomas, who had turned 17 in March, had started working with Garrett on the larger maintenance projects in the way an apprentice works with a craftsman, absorbing technique without asking to be taught, watching what Garrett did and then doing it himself until he could do it without watching. By April, he could diagnose a structural problem before Garrett had finished assessing it, and twice he'd solved one before Garrett got there. Garrett mentioned it to Evelyn one evening, not with the performance of a man making a point, but just observationally, the way he mentioned practical things. "That boy has a gift for structural work," he said. "The way he sees problems in 3 dimensions. It's not common." "I know," Evelyn said. "I've been telling him for 2 years." "Does he know what to do with it?" "He doesn't know yet what he wants to do with anything," she said. "He's 17 and he's been waiting for the ground to hold still long enough to build on it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "The ground's holding still now," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think he's starting to notice that." She was right. Thomas's particular tension, the tight-jawed, careful composure of a person who has learned not to count on things, had been loosening since February in increments so small that you could only see them if you'd been watching a long time. He argued less, not because he'd become less opinionated, but because arguing requires a defensive energy that he was apparently deploying elsewhere. He'd started talking about the spring, about what needed doing on the property, about what came after summer, which was the first time she could remember him talking about after anything. She had thought in the worst weeks of November about what happened to Thomas if the orphanage scattered. It had been the most concrete fear, the one with the sharpest edges, because Thomas was old enough to be considered beyond useful and young enough to have nothing of his own. The county placement system would have had no category for him that led anywhere good. And she had stood in the kitchen many cold nights and thought about a boy that intelligent and that guarded being sent out into a world that had no particular interest in finding out what he was capable of. She thought about that now and then put it away, because it hadn't happened, and the habit of carrying the worst versions of things that didn't happen was one she was trying to break. Nell sold her first painting in May. It happened by accident. One of the small watercolors she'd done of the horse paddock in early spring had been sitting on the windowsill drying, and a woman named Mrs. Harding, who came to the door about a charitable matter, saw it and asked about it, and then asked if she could buy it. She paid 75 cents without negotiating, which was more money than the orphanage spent on flour in a week. Nell stood in the kitchen holding the coins with the expression of someone who has just received information that requires significant revision of their understanding of themselves. "She paid for it," Nell said. "She did," Evelyn said. "She wanted it." "She wanted it." Nell looked at the coins. She was 10 years old, quiet in the way that some children are quiet because they're always listening, always absorbing, processing everything at a depth that doesn't show on the surface until suddenly it does. She'd arrived at the orphanage 2 years ago from a situation Evelyn didn't describe to the children and Nell didn't volunteer, and in 2 years she'd said more with a paintbrush than with words. She closed her hand around the coins. "Can I keep them?" she said, "or does it go to the house account?" Evelyn looked at her. "It's yours," she said. "You made it." Nell nodded once, carefully. She went upstairs. That evening she came down with a new painting. The horses again, but this time from a different angle, late afternoon light making long shadows across the paddock, and Dorothy turning her head towards something outside the frame. It was better than the first one, considerably better. She set it on the kitchen table in front of Garrett and Evelyn without explanation. They looked at it. "You can have it," Nell said. "For the wall." Garrett studied it for a moment. "Which wall?" he said. "The kitchen," Nell said. "Where the morning light comes in. That's the right light for it." He looked at the painting and then at Nell. "You know where the light hits," he said. I always look at where the light hits, she said, in the tone of someone stating something obvious. Garrett looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the painting. It goes on the kitchen wall, Evelyn said. What nobody talks about, when they talk about surviving hard things, is the strange work of the afterward. The afterward is not a resolution, exactly. It doesn't feel like the end of a story because it isn't the end of anything. It's just the continuation of days that are now, incrementally and imperfectly, better than they were before. And that improvement doesn't erase the weight of what came before it. The weight is still there. It just has somewhere to rest now. Evelyn thought about this sometimes. On the particular nights when the house was quiet, and the lamplight was low, and she was still awake while Garrett slept. She was not a woman who slept easily. She probably never would be. 11 years of waking at every sound, every creak, every small voice in the dark had built something into her that wasn't going to unlearn itself because the legal situation had resolved. But she had started to notice the difference between lying awake worrying and lying awake thinking, and the two were not the same. Worrying is circular. You cover the same ground over and over, and it doesn't get you anywhere because you're not actually going anywhere. You're just wearing a track into the floor. Thinking is different. Thinking moves. She thought about Clara, who had started school in March, and had immediately identified which teacher was competent and which one was wasting everyone's time, and had communicated this assessment to Evelyn with the frank directness that was Clara's primary mode of engagement with the world. She was going to be a difficult student, Clara. Too impatient with imprecision, too certain of her own conclusions. She was also going to be remarkable, and the teachers who were good enough to see past the difficulty would have a student who would remember them for the rest of her life. She thought about Thomas, who had started asking Garrett questions about land, not just about the work on it, but about how it was valued, how parcels were bought and sold, how the county maps were drawn. Questions that were working towards something, though Thomas hadn't named what yet. She didn't push it. You didn't push Thomas. You provided the conditions and let him get there at his own pace, and when he got there, he was sure, and sure Thomas was something to see. She thought about the others, each of them, specifically, by name, in the way she'd always thought about them at night. The accounting of 14 small particular people who were not an abstraction or a cause, but actual individual humans with their own hungers and fears and quietly forming versions of themselves. She had always done this accounting. She would probably always do it. But the accounting was different now. It wasn't checking for problems the way you check a building for structural damage before a storm. It was more like what Nell did with the light in her paintings. Just looking at where things were, noting them, holding them without needing to fix them.
Thirsty.
The last week of May. The orphanage had its windows open for the first time since October, and the smell of the yard, thawed ground, the horses, the pine trees north of the fence line, came through the kitchen in the mornings and mixed with coffee and bread and whatever the day was going to require. Garrett was on the porch after supper with Pete, who had extracted a promise weeks ago that he would be taught to identify the stars, and was now holding him to it with the tenacity that Pete brought to all commitments other people had made. Garrett was pointing up, and Pete was following his finger with the intense concentration of a boy who has decided this matters. Inside, most of the children were in the various states of winding down that preceded bedtime, which in the orphanage was a process that had approximately 15 steps and took twice as long as it should because someone always needed water, or had a question, or had remembered something urgent about tomorrow that couldn't wait. Clara was the last one down, as she often was, making one final pass through the kitchen in her nightgown before going up. She stopped at the kitchen door and looked at Evelyn, who was sitting at the table with the household accounts. There were always accounts. There would always be accounts. This was simply the permanent texture of running the place. And at Nell's painting on the wall in the lamplight, and at the row of 16 cups on the shelf. "Are all the cups ours?" Clara said. Evelyn looked at the cups. "All of them," she said. Clara looked satisfied. She looked at the door to the porch, where Garrett's voice was saying something about the bear constellation in the patient-specific way he said things when he was teaching. "He's good at stars," Clara said. "Is he right about them?" "I don't know," Clara said, "but he sounds like he knows." "That's half of it," Evelyn said. Clara considered this. "What's the other half?" "Actually knowing," Evelyn said. Clara thought about that. Then, does he actually know? Yes, Evelyn said. He actually knows. Clara nodded. She went upstairs. The third step creaked, as it always did, as it probably always would. Evelyn sat with the accounts for a while longer. The numbers were not comfortable. They were never going to be fully comfortable. That was the reality of what this place cost and what was available to spend, but they were manageable. They were, for the first time in 2 years, something that could be worked with rather than just endured. She heard Garrett say goodnight to Pete on the porch. She heard Pete's boots on the steps, and then his particular kind of running inside, which was loud, and then his voice saying goodnight already muffled by distance, and then quiet. Garrett came in through the porch door and stood in the kitchen. Bear constellation, she said, without looking up. He wanted to know all of them, Garrett said. We ran out of night before we ran out of stars. He'll want to do it again tomorrow. I know. He poured the last of the coffee, sat down across from her. How are the numbers? Manageable, she said. The Whitmore family is looking to place a child, a girl, 9 years old. Aldridge mentioned it. We have room. What's her situation? Mother died in March. Father can't manage alone. She looked at the accounts. He's not a bad man. He just doesn't know how. Garrett was quiet for a moment. She'd have a family here, he said. Yes, Evelyn said. She would. She set down her pen and looked at him across the table. He was tired in the good way, the way that comes from a full day that actually produced something, not the hollow exhaustion of spinning in place. He had dirt under his fingernails that he hadn't quite gotten clean, and there was a small cut on his left hand from where a fence wire had caught him last week. That was healing in that crooked way cuts healed when you kept using the hand. She thought, I know the shape of his hands now. I know how he drinks his coffee and how he sounds when he's laughing at something Pete said, and how he goes quiet right before he makes a decision and what that quiet looks like versus the other kind of quiet. I know him. It had been a long time since she'd known someone that way, had let herself know someone that way, which was the more honest version. She'd held people at a distance that felt like practical wisdom and was also, she understood now, a way of not having anything else to lose. You couldn't hold these people in this house at a distance. She'd never managed it with the children. It had always cost her, every time one left, every hard thing, every night she'd lain awake afraid. But the cost of having them was nothing compared to the cost of not having them, which she understood the same way you understand something only after you've almost lost it. She understood that about Garrett, too. The Whitmore girl, she said. Her name is Ruth. Good name, he said. There'd be 17 cups, she said. He looked at the shelf, back at her. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll look for a hook tomorrow, he said. She looked at him across the table, across the coffee cups and the household accounts, and the lamplit kitchen, and the whole ordinary weight of the life they'd assembled from hard materials and long work, and two people who had separately gotten used to going it alone and had, against all reasonable expectation, decided not to anymore. She reached across and turned the lamp down, not out, just lower. The kitchen went amber and warm and small against the dark outside, and the house settled around them with all its creaks and drafts, and the particular way the wind came off the northern ridge and tested the windows the way it had always done and would do again. There was a dormitory door upstairs that Clara had decided, since November, must be left open exactly 3 inches. Not 2, not 4, 3. Evelyn had tried closing it fully once, and Clara had appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later with the expression of a judge reviewing a violation. 3 inches. It let the light from the hallway fall across the floor of the room where the youngest children slept, just enough that it wasn't fully dark. Just enough to know the house was still there around them. Evelyn had stopped thinking of that as Clara's small particular requirement. She had started thinking of it as the right idea. You didn't need everything fully lit. You didn't need certainty about every corner. You needed enough. Enough light to know you weren't alone, enough ground to stand on, enough people around the table to make the table worth setting. She had thought for a long time that holding things together was a matter of will. Her will, specifically. That if she stopped, everything stopped. That the only thing standing between 14 children and the cold was her own refusal to sit down. She had not been entirely wrong, but she had been wrong about the alone part. The most honest thing she knew The thing she would not have been able to say in November and could say plainly now was this: some weight is not meant to be carried by one person. Not because the person isn't strong enough, but because weight carried alone has no witness, and a life without witness is only half a life. You need someone who sees you carrying it, someone who says, by their presence and their daily particular effort, I see what this costs, and I'm not leaving. That was what Garrett had said in his way. Not with speeches. With firewood and a sack of flour and a patient willingness to sit at her table until she stopped waiting for him to want something in return. And she had finally, at 34 years old, after 11 years of running something she was told couldn't be run, learned to say, yes, here, stay. The lamp burned low. Outside the stars were out, the ones Garrett had been naming for Pete, the same ones that were there every night whether anyone named them or not. The horses were settled in the paddock, the fence was fixed, the deed was in the document box. The orphanage stood against the dark the way it always had, but it was not the same building it had been in October. Not because of the legal documents, not because of the money, not even because of what Garrett had sold to keep it. It was different because of what had been added. Not to the walls or the roof, but to the thing the building was for. Two people who had each been carrying something alone for too long had put their burdens down in the same place and found that together the burdens were not gone, but they were different. They were livable. They were, in their own specific difficult way, a kind of home. Garrett finished his coffee. He would check the door locks before they went up. He always did that now, quietly. Without announcement. The way he did all his small protective acts. She had stopped noticing it consciously and started relying on it, which was what trust actually felt like, she'd learned. Not a feeling, a fact. Something you stopped having to decide every morning. Upstairs, 3 inches of light fell across a dormitory floor. The house held.